Tellis case out of Nevada, but before we jump back in there, let me give you an update on Susan Lawrence. The jury had a question. They actually wanted to hear both 911 calls again in that Florida case, so they heard them in open court. They are now back deliberating, and the clock is once again ticking away. We'll keep you posted on any other developments. But right now we have on the stand, it is Kimberly Dannenberger, DNA expert. We need the DNA to connect this defendant to the crime scene. He says, I didn't do it. Let's go back in.
I want to talk about the left hand, the right hand, the left ankle, and the left foot. With regard to those items or those swabs, what were your findings with regard to DNA?
So referencing those items, referring to my report, those 4 items, the results were assuming Jeffrey Gehrman is a contributor, foreign DNA was not detected. Okay. And with the left hand fingernail clippings, what was the finding with regard to that? So for the swabbing from the left hand fingernail clippings, the conclusions were assuming Jeffrey Gehrman is a contributor, the DNA profile is consistent with a mixture, including at least 1 male. Due to the limited nature of the foreign component, it is unsuitable for interpretation and no further conclusions can be made. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about that, just so we're clear. So this, the left hand fingernail clippings, the DNA evidence was analyzed, and I think you said there was evidence of a mixture. Is that right? That is correct, yes. How does that look different when you have a mixture as opposed to a single source of DNA? So when I'm doing DNA analysis, the profiles that I'm looking at, they're equivalent to like peaks on a graph. So visually, you can just visualize peaks on a graph. So when a sample is single source, depending on the number of peaks that I see and the data itself, I can make the conclusion this is from a single person. The more peaks that are added, I can then conclude that this is from a mixture DNA profile. So the mixture part is dependent upon the profile itself. Okay, and in this case, there was an indication of a mixture, but I think you said it can't be interpreted further? Yeah, so for this sample, a mixture was indicated. I was able to assume Jeffrey Gehrman on this sample. It's what we consider an intimate sample, so fingernail clippings from a person's body. There's a reasonable assumption that their DNA profile can be there. In this case, his profile was there. So the peaks that are left over, there wasn't enough for me to make any further conclusion. It's limited, so I can't do anything further. Okay, and that's just sometimes how DNA turns out? You get data that can't be interpreted further just because of the nature of the sample? Correct. And are there factors that affect that, or it just depends on how it's collected, or what is collected, or environmental factors, anything like that? There are lots of factors that can affect DNA analysis in general. I'm never going to know what kind of profile I'm going to get until I actually run the samples through our processing steps to generate a DNA profile. But in terms of what can factor in, amount of contact between 2 items, was it left out in the elements? These are just generalized factors, not specific to this case. Sure. Has there been any chemicals applied since, the contact may have occurred? I think I said handling with something touching for a long period of time or just a short amount of time. Any environmental factors such as being left out in the sun or rain, etc. So in terms of generally for DNA, there are a lot of factors that can affect how much DNA is potentially still on an item of evidence by the time it is swapped for analysis, either by crime scene or by someone at the laboratory. And you can't tell from lab results what may have affected whether or not there was more sample left or more interpretable sample left. Correct. DNA can answer the questions of who potentially was a contributor to this profile, someone included or excluded, and I can answer the question as to where that profile came from, so the fingernail swabs, but I cannot answer timeline questions. I can't say how the DNA came to be on an item of evidence, when it came to be on an item of evidence, and why. Okay, so let's go back to the September 5th report of 2022. You also analyzed the right-hand fingernail clippings swab, correct? Yes. And what was your conclusion with regard to that on September the 5th? So on September 5th, the interpretation was this was a mixture of 2 males. I did assume Jeffrey Gehrman. Again, these were fingernail clippings collected from his person, so there was a reasonable assumption that he was there given the data. And so the conclusions at that time on September 5th were assuming Jeffrey Gehrman is a contributor to the mixture DNA profile obtained, foreign DNA was detected. Okay, and did you have enough DNA in that case
to have a possible profile for that foreign DNA?
Yes.
Did you know whose it was?
No, at this time, I only had one reference standard that had been submitted to the laboratory, and that was Jeffrey Gehrman.
So you have kind of this unknown profile associate, or well, in the same sample data as Jeffrey Gehrman's profile. Would that be fair?
Yes.
Okay. And so when you have an identifiable profile, but you don't know whose it is, are there databases that you can enter a profile in?
There are, yes. If the sample itself meets eligibility, then there are databases that we can use.
And was that profile entered into databases?
It was, yes.
And which one, I mean, just generally, can you tell us which ones it was entered into?
This profile was searched, you're talking about the level, I'm sorry.
Of the identifiable foreign DNA profile, was that entered into any databases to see if it matched anything?
It was, yes.
And those would be national and local databases?
So for this case, it was able to be searched at a local level, a state level, as well as a national level.
And in all those databases, did you get any results about who could possibly be the source of that profile?
At that time, I did not know.
Okay. So let's move on to September the 7th. You ended up preparing 2 reports on September the 7th of 2022. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. So let's, I think, start with what items of evidence you actually received on September the 7th. On that date, did you receive a reference sample?
So, sorry, yes, so this is referencing supplemental number 2, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, yes. So first of that, September 7th, 2022, this is referencing my report as supplemental 2. I did receive a reference standard from Robert Tellis.
Okay, and that came to you in the form of an evidence envelope?
Yes, it came in the form of what's called a buccal swab kit. That is going to be a swabbing of the inside of one's cheek.
And September the 7th is the first day, I assume, that you had a sample from Mr. Tellis?
Yes.
So did you analyze that particular item, or did you actually process it, do the forensic processing of that buccal swab?
So for this supplemental, I did work this case from beginning to end.
And were you able to generate a profile from Mr. Tellis's buccal swab?
I was, yes.
And did you ultimately compare that to that unknown profile that came from the right fingernail clipping swab?
Yes, so this reference standard was compared to my original conclusions to that original data. So that comparison was done.
And what were your conclusions then?
So for the comparison of the buccal swab from Robert Tellis to the swabbing from the right-hand fingernail clippings, there was support. So Robert Tellis was included as a contributor to that profile. And the probability of observing the mixture DNA profile is approximately 40.9 septillion times more likely if it originated from Jeffrey Gehrman and Robert Tellis than if it originated from Jeffrey Gehrman and an unknown random contributor.
And can you kind of explain why DNA is reported out as a probability, or give us some context for that number?
So this number is what we call a likelihood ratio statistic, and it's the probability of the evidence. So it all relates back to the evidence. So the probability of the evidence, which is that swabbing from the right-hand fingernail clippings, compared to 2 different competing scenarios. So scenario 1 is that this DNA profile came from Jeffrey Gehrman and Robert Tellis. And scenario 2 is that this profile came from Jeffrey Gehrman and someone unknown, random. I don't have another buccal swab kit for them. So the probability of that evidence, given these 2 competing hypotheses, is the statistic. So there's more weight for the hypotheses or the scenario that it's Robert Tellis and Jeffrey Gehrman versus Jeffrey Gehrman and an unknown random contributor.
And that ratio, or that is numerically 40.9 septillion more times?
So that was the statistic, that the probability of the mixture profile is 40.9 septillion more times more likely if it's that scenario that I just talked about.
Okay. And that was reported out in one supplemental report from September the 7th. Is that correct?
Yes, that was all done on September the 7th. And again, that was using the original data that was reported out on September 5th.
Okay. And that evidence was originally, that evidence was worked by your colleague, Anastasia Barton?
Yes, so the report for September 5th, she was the one that had basically eyes on the evidence. She was the one that sampled from the evidence. She did start the lab processing steps that we go through. I did take over part way in the lab processing steps, so I did finish the lab processing and wrote the report. But she was the one that had the evidence. I never actually saw the physical evidence.
Okay, so you never handled the fingernail clippings, right hand, anything like that. You just have the data from that.
Yes, so I never handled the actual evidence.
Okay. Now, I want to move on to your second report from September the 7th, and it appears these were rocks with staining collected from the crime scene. There were 2 rocks and a swab from a bird bath.
Yes.
All right, so important, this testimony now linking by DNA the defendant to the fingernails of the victim. 40.9 septillion, that's a lot of zeros. Taking a break, we'll come back. More Tell Us. Cross-exam is going to be very interesting. We'll be right back.